Hello and welcome to episode 399 of the Crate and Crowbar, a gaming podcast. That's a big number, isn't it? It's getting bigger all the time. This is recorded on the 16th of June 2022. I'm Marsh Davis, and this week I'm joined by Jamie Britton.
Hello.
Hello, Jamie. It's E3 week. Or rather, it isn't, because E3 is spending a second year, I think, dead for pandemic reasons. So, instead, this week has been simply haunted by the ghost of E3, which apparated in several baleful forms, including possessing the grim spectre of definite human man Jeff Keighley for the Summer Game Fest platform agnostic showcase, and then also several other platform and publisher-specific showcases, which we will talk about very partially. Jamie, even Keighley himself warned everyone to lower their expectations of this year, which is always bodes well. I didn't actually catch this conference, but did you experience just the right amount of Keighley-sanctioned disappointment?
Yes, I think that's right. I think he set up the disappointment levels perfectly. And I watched it, and there was a couple of things that made me go, ooh. And then a whole bunch of stuff that was just like, standard, well, I don't know what this game is. Or this is just the same game that you've already made. So yeah, I still find it fun. I admit I do miss, the live conference, the live big showcase things, because it's always fun when they have the kind of big moments where everyone cheers and stuff like that. I mean, everyone loves all that. So it's a bit of a shame we don't have that anymore, although probably quite right. Jeff Keighley is Jeff Keighley, sorry, I was saying in our green room that I want to pronounce his name like the town in Yorkshire, but it is Keighley. He's an interesting one. Like, I wasn't really aware of him until quite recently, and he does seem like a kind of AI projection of the industry's collected, worries and guilt and fear about the future. But I think he's a very amiable presence. I was very taken with him finally revealing Elden Ring. And his voice was kind of breaking with emotion as he finally got to show the gameplay trailer for it. And I thought, oh, he really does seem to care about this stuff, So that's a nice thing to see.
Well, artificial intelligence is getting more and more convincing. It
absolutely.
Seems all the time.
That's that Google AI guy who's been in the news recently.
Yeah, they should have asked Google's AI what he thought of Elden Ring.
And then everyone runs screaming from the room, going, "Get out of my mind!" So I watched it. There were some good bits where like stupid stuff happened. I mean, nothing quite on the level of those guys who turned up a couple of years ago from Deviation Games and talked about how their team of deviators was going to do like deviator things, which is one of the funniest things I've ever seen anyone do, I think. But did Hideo Kojima? No, he was at the later one, wasn't he? He was at the Microsoft one. But they did have, for example, the game Stormgate, which is a new RTS from ex-Blizzard devs. And as someone quite rightly pointed out on Twitter, the dude just turned up with some JPEGs of some key art, and just a lot of promises that it was going to be a really fun, a StarCraft-style game. But I was just watching it, just thinking, well, why are you talking about it? Like, it's just a statement of intent. But I'll tell you, I'll stop slagging things off because there's actually some good stuff in there. The thing I was most taken with, I think, was Warhammer 40k Dark Tide, which had a gameplay reveal trailer, which I thought looked absolutely spectacular. I really enjoy the 40k universe kind of from afar. I've never been able to kind of get into the tabletop game, but I think it's a really good space to kind of paddle around in. And in fact, the sheer like weight of the lore and the ridiculousness of the universe can be, like I say, really fun to just kind of paddle about in and kind of. I've been playing the new XCOM which has lots of titles, as is the lore for 40k games, which is called something like Chaos Gate Demon Hunters.
Yes.
Which is really good fun and is completely over the top and ridiculous. And yeah, just like a great world to be a tourist in. And similarly with 40k Dark Tide, which is by the guys who did Vermintide and Vermintide 2, which are brilliantly fun games. And out of all of the kind of squad shooters, I think it's Vermintide 2 in particular is one of the ones that's really stood the test of time. And Darktide just looks like, it's the 40k version of that, hyper violent, hyper sci-fi squad shooter, lots of explosions. They've got the kind of genial announcer from Vermintide to do a kind of dystopian like voiceover sort of weirdo Blade Runner type thing, which I think is great fun. It's got that kind of characteristic sense of humor to it. And yeah, if it's anything like as kind of kinetic and hyper violent as the trailer, I think in for a treat with that one.
I'm
Yes.
definitely very excited for that. Yeah, it looks really cool. I'm also excited, just on sticking with Warhammer for a second. I read a bit today about Rogue Trader, which is the first CRPG apparently in the Warhammer 40k universe. But that sounds like a good pitch. I'd be up for that.
Yeah, me too. And I think there's another Space Hulk game coming as well. I think I saw that too, Space Hulk 2. I think it's just like, because it's like this maximalist sci-fi world with no edges, it just goes on forever. I think it's a really excellent prospect for video gaming. I mean, I know there's been a lot of bad games based there, but I do think, and like there just seems to be an endless amount of them. But still, yeah, I think it's almost like a kind of, and I'm sure some of the more Warhammer literate members of the pod team could expound on this, but like the idea that it is this kind of colossal pool of just kind of crazy metal stuff that I think that people can draw upon. I just think that's really good fun. Another game that stood out to me was the Callista Protocol. So this is the game from the Dead Space dev team, who kind of reformed to make this game, as I understand it. When it was first announced, they announced it as being set in the PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds universe, but far in the future. An idea which they've since dropped because clearly it's a ridiculous idea. Because as far as I understand, the PlayerUnknown doesn't have any lore in particular. So the idea of setting this game specifically in that universe is very, very peculiar. And I think they have now admitted that, that was a silly idea. But really, really good-looking trailer, hyper-violent, like insanely violent. Like video games obviously love being violent. It's one of the things they're best at. But this one... This one was really violent, and it ends. The trailer is very short, and it's a guy walking his way through a gruey space station full of horrible beasties, and looks really gorgeous. There was a moment where he killed a monster and picked up 40 Callista credits, which is obviously the in-game currency. But it just made me laugh because I don't know why I thought this, but it was just like, what are you going to spend that on? It's clearly gone to absolute shit here. I mean, obviously upgrades, but still, it's just like, you're never going to get a bag of Maltesers. And the trailer ends with the character being unexpectedly sucked into a big, like meat grinder sort of bit of machinery in the environment, and they've like animated the absolute hell out of that moment. It's so frightening. You really see the look on the dude's face as he is ground into mince.
Oh, wonderful.
He looks really upset about it. As you would. So yeah, that looks like it looks like fun. I mean, I probably won't play it because I tried to play Dead Space and it really like shit me up. Like,
too scary for me.
It's really like alarmingly frightening game.
It did feel like 90% of the announcements this year were sci-fi horror. So probably, I guess that's true of every year, really. But I mean, there did seem to be a particular kind of horror bent to a lot of space set things. And there was an Aliens tactical game as well, right?
Yeah,
that was part of that. I mean,
there was one of those, and then there was also a game that was announced like in 2014, and then they went quiet on.
Oh yeah, Routine. Yeah.
Yes,
that's been God. I mean, 10 years in development hell. I don't know. It's been hell. Maybe they've been having a great time making this game for 10 years. But it's weird. I mean, it's weird how many of these games are not only space horror games, but also space horror games which we sort of wield a particular sort of retro projected vision of the future. Like routine is very sort of 80s set. A lot of things within the Aliens universe have a kind of 80s vision of the future as well. It's interesting. I mean,
Yeah, I do.
is
think
it interesting?
I know.
Maybe it's just derivative. I don't know.
I actually do think it's interesting because a whole theme of the like one of the main trends I've noticed throughout my deep analysis, as I am that guy from Moneyball, but for games apparently. But one of the trends I haven't even seen Moneyball. One of the trends I've noticed is like games set in the future, but also the past. Like that seems to be, you know, in the kind of mixture of people doing like Doom likes and Quake likes. And we'll talk about a N64 FPS like later. It seems like that is one of the things that people are really horny for at the moment, which is a weird sense of like, retro futurism, you might call it, where you're kind of, as you say, kind of enjoying something that's kind of retrograde and passe, whilst at the same time being kind of up to date. It's interesting.
Well, it's interesting to compare that because I had a thought about this as I was watching the trailer for Fort Solace, which is another, I don't know what kind of game it is actually, but it's obviously some spooky space game featuring, amongst others, the voice acting talents and possible likeness of Troy Baker. But like a lot of science fiction, like especially the things we've been talking about up until now, like in order to try and make it feel rooted and real, there's often that sort of like a tendency to hark back to that past and sort of scuff up the visuals and make them fuzzy, like a fritzing, security camera with scan lines, or have chunky buttons, or have crackling voice channels, particularly because I guess like a lot of the kind of culturally dominant experience of space exploration has obviously necessarily been rooted in our experience of its infancy, because we've been through that period and that's what we associate with space exploration. And like, obviously, if one were to earnestly imagine the future, we could easily imagine crystal clear voice communications because we largely have them now. and yet, when I was watching that trailer, I couldn't help feel it was unconvincing because the audio diary Troy Baker was delivering lacked static interference. It was too clean. It didn't feel right. I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I'm an absolute sucker.
Yeah,
but maybe not so much of a sucker that the wobbly glass in Alien Isolation didn't annoy me.
It does seem like there's a very like there's sort of two poles of video game sort of sci-fi future. One in which the technology is really like technology and really like crazy good, and in those universes there's always a rogue AI that's going to murder everyone.
Of course.
And then there's the other version where everything's retro-y and bleepy and the old school 20th Century Fox logo comes up at the beginning, and in that one there's Gribblies in the dark, and you can't you have to choose one. Like there's no way of doing both. So yeah,
no Gribblies in the slick future.
No Gribblies in the slick future. I will grant you that you can sometimes have a slick future that becomes a Gribbly future, but you're never going to be playing in slick. You're only ever going to be in Gribbly.
I feel this needs a graph of some kind.
Absolutely.
Calling out for infographics to get on the case here.
Yes, I mean, I'm also speaking about shooting things in the past, but it's also the future. One of the things that was announced at Key 3 was a Last of Us 1 remake, which I don't know. Like, there's a bit of me that wants to get all groany and sort of, say, well, why are they spending their time, remaking a game that they've already remastered once? But there's another part of me which may be the part that has just finished playing the Resident Evil 2 remake, which wants me to say maybe it's fine. Maybe it's fine to just keep remaking the same games over and over again with incremental visual clarity. I mean,
yeah. I think we'll probably have more to say about this when we start talking about the retro throwback games that you've been playing as part of the Steam Next Fest. But I do think that maybe remakes, like straight up remakes rather than retro throwbacks, sort of have a better excuse in that there is a conservation element to their existence, I think, which is actually quite reasonable. Like, a lot of these games become inaccessible or simply fall out of popularity by not being technologically sufficient for the current moment. And there's no reason really in other ways why they should be forgotten or left in the past. And I don't particularly begrudge them being resuscitated with an extra level of polish. And also, like, if you're going to remake a game at all, it seems like you would probably remake them now rather than later, because it feels like we're at maybe not so much with The Last of Us, which is of a cycle of technology which has barely disappeared from beneath people's televisions, but with regards to a lot of these remakes, they're looking at a step change now and then probably a plateau of technology for a while. So, if you're going to remake it at all, you'd remake it now, right? Knowing that plateau is going to persist for a while.
Yes, I think that's probably right. And like I played recently on Xbox Game Pass, I played Gears of War 1, and at some point in the past they gave that a kind of a redo, a little more than a remaster. I think they haven't done it on Gears of War 2 and 3 because there's no need. Those games feel more or less modern, and they're perfectly playable, and it means you can play through that trilogy and they all feel of a piece together. And they did something similar with the Mass Effect games too. And I do agree that actually the sense of preservation about these things is pretty well founded, because we're looking at games from a couple of decades back, and having some if it wasn't for sort of the emulation world, these things would be lost, and it makes them infinitely more difficult to play and certainly play legally. So yeah, I think generally it's okay. They're also doing a Last of Us, like a massively like battle royale game, I think, which is in very early stages. God knows what that would look like, but that's kind of interesting, I guess. If you're a Last of Us fan, I imagine that's kind of. I mean, it's hard to imagine what a Last of Us fan looks like, considering, like, from what I saw of that sequel, it is really it really puts its audience through the ringer, that one. And kind of wants them to ask what they're doing there.
Yeah, I did. I didn't actually play The Last of Us 2, but I did watch all of the cutscenes. I couldn't face it. They're two kind of grueling. Both. I also noped out of The Last of Us 1 at some point and just watched a friend's playthrough of it, because I just found it too oppressive to actually interact with. Strangely, and I felt the same about the second one. That actually all the being asked to participate in just a relentless murder of people who are probably largely blameless, apart from the terrible situation they find themselves in, I just couldn't stomach it. But I found, as a movie, it to be quite compelling.
Yeah, when it comes this sort of weird, it's really interesting because it's this super AAA, super high budget series that is almost a kind of piece of transgressive art about violence itself, almost like a kind of American Psycho sort of piece of sort of extreme literature. It's something, people have been worried about violence in video games for decades, and it seems like that's a game that really tries. I mean, I haven't played it. I've watched bits and bobs of it. How successful it is, I don't know. And I know there's people who think it's not at all successful in that. But certainly interesting, that someone really took a punt on that.
Well, nobody wants to be lectured by a game which is also inviting you to sin and tell you off for sinning at the same time. But I did. I think the way it mitigates that to some extent, because I think the first one is more about like, oh, aren't we really the monsters? Sort of, which is quite a well-trodden ground for zombie fiction, and I find that a little bit tedious. But then the in its sort of climax, it does ask more interesting questions about the specific characters, which is always more engaging if you have a character who is defined and has very particular foibles, which are then worked upon by the plot. That for me is much more exciting than the kind of larger scale moral finger wagging that it's doing. And the second one also does, fairly well trodden ground in terms of revenge fiction. Is revenge really worth it, Jamie? There are differing opinions upon that. but it does it in a way which is tragic and convincing, and ultimately really hurts to watch, in a way which I would compare to like revenge / self-destruction masterpieces like Blue Ruin or things of that. But anyway, yeah. Sorry, I'm getting away from the point here. I don't really know how a multiplayer only version of that is going to sell the same idea. But Naughty Dog's multiplayer stuff, whilst always sort of feeling quite unnaturally divorced from the games that they've been attached to, has always been really kind of classy. I absolutely loved the Uncharted, especially Uncharted 2 and 3's multiplayer were fantastic, and no one would play them with me.
Oh, if only I'd known you back then, Marsh, because I love those as well. I thought they were.
Yeah.
I remember playing a lot of the Uncharted 2 and 3. They had that kind of, almost a kind of weird. I'd compare it a little bit to like playing Chivalry 2 now. They almost have a kind of like farcical knockabout comedy vibe to them, because they were sort of so bonkers and didn't really.
You can monkey around all over the things.
That's right.
Clambering around these buildings like you're a crab, and diving onto people's heads. Fantastic.
They announced Flashback 2, which I, as someone who purchased the game Fade to Black, with God knows how I must have bought it, because it would have cost like £40 or £50 in the 90s. So somehow I acquired a copy of early 3D shooter Fade to Black, which I thought was the sequel to Flashback, but apparently not. Apparently that's just been announced. But that should be interesting. I mean, Flashback was always a weird game. It was one of those cinematic platformers that
rotoscoped,
yeah. So yeah, and very French. So yeah, I'm interested in that. I could never get very far in Flashback because everything was so laboriously difficult. Which they very much updated into 3D for Fade to Black. I think Fade to Black might have been a game I never got past the first level on. Despite
£40-50 well spent.
Absolutely. I can't have spent that much. I must have got it at a car boot sale or something. But I remember getting it and being very excited about it because it was like pre-Tomb Raider 3D. You know, you could do the thing where you press yourself up against a wall as a guard is approaching you and then dart out from cover and shoot him in the head, you know. I mean, it was more or less impossible with the controls that they gave you. And as I say, I never got past the first level, but, you know. So, yeah, that stirred some memories of that. Sorry, talking nonsense. American Arcadia was another game that was announced at Key 3, and I didn't understand what this was at all, but it was incredibly striking looking. So much so that a moment ago I just looked it up on Steam to try and work out what the hell it was. But it is a kind of side on another kind of cinematic platformer that is kind of set in some kind of weird utopian television thing, and it just looked quite striking and interesting. So I was interested in that one as well.
That one passed me by. I haven't heard about that at all.
Yeah, it's kind of, what does it say here? A 70s retrofuturistic again, metropolis where all its citizens enjoy a life of luxury and comfort, unaware that they're being broadcast live 24/7. So yeah, it's one of those.
It's like the Truman Show meets the Jetsons.
Yes, meets Inside.
Meets Inside. Okay, yeah.
So yeah, that was another one. So yeah, I thought, you know, it was an okay little ceremony, and I think there's enough kind of, you know, there's certainly enough horror shooters coming up for everyone to enjoy. You know, it did really lack a kind of, you know, it would have been great if there'd been an Elden Ring DLC announcement there. I think that would have been really excellent, or something like that. And there was nothing, there was no massive surprises. But you know, what are you going to do? You can't have everything. I mean, it'd be great to have massive surprises, but if no one's made a game or is making one, then you can't have that.
Yeah, I think everything's just still somewhat delayed by the last couple of years of pandemic. And I think it makes sense that people are holding off a little bit longer.
Yeah, they managed to sort of push out a couple of the bigger releases, didn't they? Like, you know, Elden Ring finally was released and stuff like that. But that's the kind of ones we got, and now we're back in a bit of a dip. Although I will say that the Bethesda and Microsoft conference was significantly kind of, more impressive in many ways.
Do you think so?
Well, no,
Well,
I don't actually think so. They had some stuff to show, I guess, was a thing.
the sartorial choices of the presenters were more conservative. I'll put it that way. Jeff Keighley seemed to be wearing velour. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, actually, I said that, but it begins with Sarah Bond in a sort of dungaree dress, which was very impressive. But then the rest of it
I have to say,
settles.
I don't know anything about fashion, but I know what I like, and her dress was excellent.
Yeah, it was definitely more outre than the bootcut jeans and slimming in inverted commas blazer combos that dominated the rest of the. So anyway, the games were fine too, I guess.
Todd Howard was wearing Claire from Resident Evil 2's jackets, which I guess he picked off their corpse or something.
They wouldn't fit him. It'd be like putting a tent on him. Anyway,
I half expected him to have one earring like David Brent in the Office Christmas special.
I don't know, one of the biggest shocks from the Microsoft Bethesda conference wasn't a game announcement, but it was the sort of a more boring game biz announcement, which is that Riot's putting all their games on Game Pass and making it so that you don't need to grind or even unlock any of the characters in the games, which are entirely designed around grinding to unlock characters, which is interesting. I on one hand, I really welcome it from a sort of consumer point of view, but I'm really fascinated to know what it will do to the culture of that game, the game balance, onboarding, all these other things. Because I'd imagine they'd be sort of knocked for a loop by it. But it's quite exciting to see that. I think that represents good value. In as much as I am wary of Game Pass as a subscription service, I do prefer a subscription service to grinding freemium games, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how basically the entire economy of video gaming generally is sort of reforming now, sort of finally following on from the sort of Netflix model, and it's kind of unclear as to where that will land. I mean, Netflix have got themselves in this terrible bother now where they outspent everyone else early on, and for them it's now a kind of, they have to kind of see if they can stay afloat long enough to kind of beat the people that they crippled by outspending them in the first place. And Microsoft have been clearly really flashing the cash recently, and it is it's nice to see some of those models being a bit more, it's nice to see that the NFT shit went away pretty quick, and it's nice to see stuff like the Riot games not being quite so aggressively free to play nonsense type stuff going on there. So it'll be interesting to see where it all ends up. Yeah. Hopefully.
Shall I go through some of the other announcements?
Please do.
There was a trailer for on a sequel to A Plague Tale, which was Asobo's very 7 out of 10 rat swarm physics simulator set in a sort of alternate France of some past era. It looked grim in a good way. I don't know. Do you have any feelings about that particularly?
No? I quite like the idea that you could make a kind of rat tornado in the first game. That sounds quite cool.
Yeah. I tell you what, I wish they'd put that tech in other games, like the way that Ubisoft shares around its technology amongst other studios. Like you could press a button in Forza and subsume your competitors in a tidal wave of tiny Nissan Micras. But unfortunately, they haven't done that, because they did show the new Forza game, and they haven't done that. But they have, Jamie, rendered anodized aluminium with greater levels of fidelity than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, like Forza 5 is the first like driving game I've sort of played in decades, really. And I think the last one I actually owned was like Gran Turismo 1 or something. And it was I really enjoyed kind of getting into that. It was really fun like that game. I mean,
but it's just going around a road, isn't it? It's going around a road. It doesn't matter how anodized your aluminium is. You're just going around a road over and over.
While people shout encouragement to you, like you're, like you're a sort of moron, like trying to tell you that you're having loads of fun. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, I got a good like 10 hours out of Forza 5. of driving around while everyone shouts how wonderful I am at driving. And saw some great sights on the way. I think it's
Yeah, I'd say I was a bit. That was not the right target for my snark. I don't particularly like car games, but actually, I do really like all the graphical fanciness that they deliver on the back of car games. I'm altogether excited about the rendering of Dirt in Dirt even Dirt franchise. But
I tried to play a Dirt game recently. I bought Dirt 4, I think was on sale, or Dirt 3, a couple of Dirts back. And I played it for about 15 minutes and then remembered that this wasn't for me at all. It's far too difficult. I have no desire whatsoever to have mastery over the mud, so I stopped playing. Got my £4 back.
There was also Overwatch 2, which I just don't know about at all. Really, I got heavily into Overwatch 1 for a time, but I just, with so many of these multiplayer service games, I got left behind by the meta. I just took a break from it, and I couldn't get back into it. And I just feel kind of exhausted by it. And obviously the idea of making Overwatch 2 is to break that spell, essentially, and it should be conceivable that I'd be able to get into Overwatch 2. But I just don't feel that they were making that pitch at all, to me personally, which is rude, obviously. They should have addressed my personal problem with their franchise. But it just didn't feel like that's what they were selling, was a new game into which people could jump. But actually, it was all about evoking a very strong sense of continuity and affection for characters who I 510% despise, and all their awful catchphrases. So it didn't really work for me.
They're doing a weird thing with it, aren't they? Where they're kind of growing Overwatch 2 inside Overwatch 1. Like it's a strange model they're doing, where they will slowly, like, it is a kind of a 2.0 release in all. Well, I mean, it's literally a 2.0 release, but it's a kind of, the way they're releasing it and the way they're rolling it out is to kind of slowly replace Overwatch 1's kind of architecture as well. So it's a kind of a very strange way of doing it, where they've kind of implanted it within and are kind of letting it kind of grow and spread, and
like a parasitic wasp eating its host from the inside out.
That's right. But
that's the catchphrase they should have gone for. That's the pitch. I did notice that there's a new character who is just as awful as all the others, but she has a spray painted gun. I noticed there were a lot of spray painted guns this year, like guns that are spray painted with like "eat this" or in neon pink or some, to imply that the characters are like all youthy, and like totally countercultural, while at the same time, they've paid some amount of game bucks for this neon rimmed machine gun grip or whatever, which is as uncountercultural as I can imagine. It just strikes me as deeply untruthful. No more spray painted guns. That's my new rule. How about that?
I think that's a good one.
What else?
Solid rule.
Vin Diesel's in the new Ark game. He doesn't actually say anything in the trailer. He literally just issues a single grunt, and yet it's him. Like immediately, you even without his very terrible CG stand-in, you would know it was Vin Diesel. That's star power. If you can grunt.
His little piece to camera, I realised, was the exact moment where he stopped being charming to me. I've been in for The Rock for a while. I remember watching The Scorpion King and thinking, you know what, that Rock is. But yeah, that's run dry now, and I'm bored of him, and he's a tedious man who needs to go away.
Oh, that's The Rock. No, I'm Vin Diesel. Who I was talking about.
There was a game with The Rock as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, I missed that one and that announcement though.
Man. I mean, they are the same man, so it is hard.
Wow, that you're spoken like not an aficionado of the Fast and franchise. Fast and franchise? Did I say that? Fast and Furious franchise, and also its ancillary drama offset. So not the same man. Jeez. Flintlock looked cool. It's a sort of over-designed Souls-like boss rush game with kind of fun weapons. It has a terrible subtitle, Siege of Dawn, but it does have your character has a very small hammer in it. Or rather, like a realistically sized warhammer, which is, much smaller than games typically depict hammers to be. So yeah, I don't know why I seized upon that detail. So yes, no spray painted guns, but more realistically sized hammers.
Well,
That's what I want
that's
from the
good to
industry
know.
now.
That's a good slogan.
There's Minecraft Legends, which I actually worked on a little bit in very early pre-production. I didn't really have much to say about the overall design of the game, but we were sort of working out what genres we'd like to explore alongside Minecraft and who we'd want to work with. And when they turned out they were up for it, we helped sort of work on their pitch for us. But anyway, sorry, it's an RTS from Blackbird Interactive, who did Homeworld, Deserts of Karak, and they're making Homeworld 3, and they made Hard Space Shipbreaker. So they're, a cool studio made up of a lot of former Relic devs who are also, storied RTS developers. And they're a really cool bunch to meet and work with. Definitely amongst the most impressive studios that we took pictures from at the time, because they were just really committed in a way which I felt was unusually genuine to making something that was a meritful game in its own right, and that stayed true to like some of the core mechanics in Minecraft in very thoughtful ways. And I have absolutely no knowledge of how it's turned out since then, but I'm pretty excited to find out, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm never going to be a sort of Minecraft, standard Minecraft player. Although I've played it a little bit, but I really love. I'm sort of really interested in anything that takes place there. I've played a whole bunch of Minecraft Dungeons. I think it's a really, really, really great game.
You're welcome.
and and similarly with this, I was also kind of it's such a friendly world. You kind of immediately feel at ease there one way or another, and so you kind of ready for anything in terms of like what they want to throw at you. And the idea that Minecraft is this kind of very trusted provider to a lot of people, I think it gives a nice vibe that like, oh, they've given their I say you, Marsh, have given your sort of approval to something. It has a nice kind of vibe of being sort of authored and sort of presented to you by a trusted patron. So yeah, that looks really interesting.
Nice to hear you describe me as a trusted patron. That's how I think of myself. But talking of dungeons, so with Diablo 4, which obviously it shares some DNA with, was shown looking much more grim and splattery than certainly Dungeons is. I'm not. Are you a Diablo fan? I'm not really a great judge of these games. So I played them, but I have quite a casual acquaintance with them in contrast to the two Toms.
Yes, I like them. I always want to. I've probably bought them several times on several different platforms, and I always think this is the time when I'm going to really like go for it and really get into Diablo, and it's going to be my like forever game where I'm just constantly going back to it, and I always get bored after about 5 or 6 hours, but it is always a really good fun 5 or 6 hours. Diablo 3 I think is it's so like friendly in so many ways that it's it's great fun to just kind of pick up and blast through and then forget about. I have to admit, watching the Diablo 4 trailer, I started off going like, oh come on, like this is just haven't we done enough of this stuff? But then by the end of the trailer, it completely won me over, and I was just like, oh, I'm definitely going to play this when it comes out. It looks wicked,
Oh yeah, I wasn't totally on board with it because it does look very miserable. There was one part that made me laugh where it's like if you can sort of like free up areas of demonic contamination, and it's like then you can turn them into settlements, and it cuts to this picture of like these 4 ragged looking people looking forlornly at their feet as they sit in mud. It's like, yay!
Yeah, it's great living here.
Yeah,
we're having fun.
And then you saw a guy just roll over enemies with a giant blood sausage. So that seemed up my street as well.
Yeah, I think it looks like a lot of fun, and I like the idea of because like Diablo 3 has a kind of toe in that kind of vibe, but is also a little bit. It's kind of camper, and this is this new one is also kind of camp as well, but in a kind of slightly different, slightly more hard edged way, and I think that looks like quite a lot of fun. So yeah, no, I'm definitely up for a bit of Diablo 4. I think I'll definitely be playing that one. I like the big monster at the end of the trailer. The big giant thing. That was cool.
That was cool. There's a I assume it's a game listed in my notes, and all I've written is ball bug in caps. I don't remember what that was about.
I think that was the game by the guy who was the lead designer or gameplay designer on Inside and Limbo. And he's done a new game. It was on the cover of Edge a couple of months ago. I forget its name off the top of my head.
Ballbug, clearly.
Is it Ballbug?
No, I suspect that is not what it's called.
But yeah, Ballbug, and I look. It does look. It looks very interesting. I mean, the trailer is a bug picking up balls and putting them on plinths. Which, slightly made me go, oh, this doesn't seem like Inside. Inside is a horrifying meditation on conformity and violence in a brutal dystopic world, and this is a bug chucking orbs around. But that guy has got an amazing track record and having made 2 of the best games ever, in my opinion. So hopefully, I'm sure there will be some kind of twists and turns in Ballbug or Bug Balls, whatever it's called. And I noted on Twitter that they said they've been making it for sort of 5 or 6 years. So yeah, that looks kind of fascinating. I'll play anything that guy makes, because Inside is still one of the best game experiences I think I've ever had. So yeah.
Should we skip to the end? I think we should skip to the end. There's a big, long-awaited reveal of Starfield, which is Bethesda's next mega RPG, as it's almost certain to be. Got quite a lot of flack on my timeline. I have to admit I wasn't particularly into it, but everybody else seemed to be upset at it for potentially overpromising. That it claims to have 1,000 explorable planets, and everyone's like, well, how many of those are going to be interesting? Which is a very fair question to ask. But I say my beef with it was more rudimentary in that it was just absolutely rote science fiction 101. Like, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised by that, in that, maybe the Elder Scrolls isn't the most wild, out there fiction itself. But I mean, you're going to be working on this game for like a substantial portion of your life, and I just imagine, isn't there something inside you, just like a tiny voice that says, maybe make this just more interesting than investigating alien relics, mining ore, space pirates, cyberpunk dive bars, just like all the things that you've seen before? Wouldn't you want to come up with just like one novelty on which to hang the premise off? And maybe it has that. Like, maybe there is something wild and crazy in there, but it definitely wasn't in the trailer. And what was weird is that I felt like some of the earlier stuff that we saw before this announcement was actually more promising, that it had a sort of interesting aesthetic to it, where a lot of the spacesuits, for example, and the concept art seemed to be quite grounded in again, like with a sort of retro futurism, and that it was like a projection of a sort of very pragmatic era of NASA design projected into the future. And then but actually with this trailer, I felt that it was very aesthetically inconsistent, because you had some of this quite beautifully designed retro futuristic stuff, and then there was also quite a lot of just very incongruous sort of generic techno gribble as well. It just didn't work for me. I'm actually quite happy with the 1,000 planets thing. I mean, I don't feel the need to explore all them all, but I'm just not sold on the stuff that they might fill it with. It's actually the content rather than the absence of content that disturbs me.
Yes, I mean, I imagine they've thought about the 1,000 planet things very carefully. Because, my guess is that they found a really nifty way around. Obviously they can't do 1,000. They can't do one planet's worth of content. Planets are big, so obviously they found some way around that, and I think that is fine. Because otherwise you're going to make No Man's Sky, or you're going to make the weird like planets that they have in Mass Effect 1. Where it's like it's a different color and then it has the same building on it. It's I think they've probably found a really nifty way to get around that. So I'm not so bothered by that. I tend to agree that they are people who kind of tend to make these worlds which have a very narrow sort of field of view. Like the highs and lows are kind of I've got a thing on my microphone right now which limits the frequencies so that all the horrible sounds that are around me right now are hopefully cut out, and it does obviously cut into the beautiful sound of my voice. And I slightly feel with Bethesda games like that they're limiting their frequencies to keep it safe and to keep it stable, and to kind of, in this, when you play a game like The Witcher 3, where every time you come upon something you think is going to be one thing, they've made huge amounts of effort into twisting it into something different, and to surprise you, and to kind of take the story in unusual directions. And from what they showed of the kind of the game and the story and the content, it seemed like it was very much playing in a kind of safe kind of space.
Yeah, everything is very familiar.
And I get that they kind of feel like they have a duty to that, because people have certain expectations of them, and people have a kind of a desire to live in these spaces, to kind of set up jobs and careers and lives in these worlds, and therefore you can't make them too spiky and individual, because then you're sort of denying someone their own ability to put their mark on it. But I think that people are more willing to accept. I think that's a too conservative way of looking at what audiences are into. I think if you look at Elden Ring, which I completed recently, no big deal. Yeah. That is a really good example of a massive open world that takes, not infinite amounts of unusual choices, but often takes them when it has the option to. And doesn't worry too much about being ridiculous or looking silly. Sometimes it does look silly, but sometimes it looks unearthly and wonderful and strange. And I do worry that Bethesda slightly worry a bit too much about, that. I also think, like, the first thing that happened in the trailer, like the big grandiose moment, the spaceship lands on the planet and the character steps out onto the planet and walks through an arch of rock, and the first thing he does is takes out his mining laser and lasers off some rock for his rock collection.
Yeah, I think I made an involuntary noise at that point, which probably would not have gone down well with the audience sentiment that they were looking for.
I just think that's a very bad idea to put that right at the front of your trailer. That is the most, that's the thing that you do in No Man's Sky that is so. They've had to build an entire game's worth of stuff that isn't that, to make people forget how tedious it was to fire a mining laser at some rock and collect some rocks. And I do not know why that was the first thing they showed.
I have to say, your point about people sort of building lives within this world, which they don't to some extent in spikier, sort of more idiosyncratic fictions. That is a really interesting point. I had not considered that at all. I'll have to go away and think about that. Though, on the other hand, it was revealed that when you purchase your starter home in Starfield, it comes with a mortgage. And I actually just sort of gave up feeling any emotions whatsoever about anything at that point. I just think, what's the point? We're all going to pay taxes and die eventually, aren't we? So let's just forget about the stars. We don't need them. Let's just climb into a hole in the cold and caring earth and let the soil fall in around us and go to sleep forever.
Yeah, it sounds great. Make that game. I mean, I think it'll be. I think they're going to make a really solid game, and I think it's a shame that it will probably end up being a solid game. An 8 or a 9 out of 10. When what you would hope is this is the next generation. This will be the sort of watershed moment for what you can do, and it's not going to be that. And I think people were probably a bit disappointed in that, but they'll get over it, and I think it'll probably end up being a lot of fun. And also the great thing about these games is that the modding scenes are they're just insane, and so there's always going to be a huge amount of interesting stuff and creativity. And I feel pleased for the people who make that their hobby, that they get to have a whole new sort of canvas to paint on.
It did actually prompt a discussion with Tom and Alex about whether we are inherently more forgiving of generic fantasy than generic sci-fi, which I thought was interesting. Like we were totally fine with being just some fucking medieval dude in Realm of Orcs, The Reckoning of Dawn, or something. But like, if science fiction doesn't immediately present us with a distinct premise, then we just like completely turned off. I wonder, do you think that's true? Like, I think that maybe fantasy just sort of comes out of the box with a bunch of sort of parameters that we have to be okay with because they more or less map onto our conception of medievalism, like inaccurately or otherwise. Whereas sci-fi sort of has to actively set those parameters, and so it's like super apparent when that opportunity has been squandered.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think the verbs of low fantasy are just inherently more fun. Like, hit man in head with axe is just always going to be great. Fire arrow at man. Sacrifice pig to God. It's just all much more easy to kind of get involved with. Whereas in like sci-fi, you've got a whole universe of shit you can be doing. I mean, obviously, fire laser at man is always going to be a crowd pleaser. But
How
like
about fire laser ore? Not so good.
not good at all. And you can't mine ore with an axe. I've decided. So,
Okay.
and that's going on my t-shirt. But no, I think the suggestion of a kind of low fantasy world is just inherently more fun. It feels like it has less responsibility to kind of shock and surprise us. Whereas in sci-fi and sort of futuristic type stuff, and I think that's probably why everyone's doing retrofuturism now as well, is it's it just kind of for whatever reason, it just kind of feels tiresome to be like, we're here in space and anything is possible. We want the sort of mud and the muck and the hitting people with axes, which is why that that Warhammer Darktide game looks excellent, because it is both hitting people with axes and shooting them with lasers.
Well, I suppose it also absolves you of a need to come up with a really convincing vision of the future. If instead you're saying, no, we're not doing a vision of the future. We're doing the wrong vision of the future as it was seen in the 80s, which we know is wrong, but it's kind of cool because it's retro.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that was about it for those conferences, but it wasn't the end of the E3 festivities because there's also been Next Fest, right, which is Steam's summertime deluge of demos, and you've been playing some of them, I think, right, Jamie?
I have, although I did want to mention one other game that came out which is the Obsidian game that looks like it's a medieval manuscript.
Oh yes, sorry, my internet went down at that point during the presentation, so I missed that actually.
I think it might be called Pentiment,
Yes.
and it's by Obsidian. It is a kind of sort of Name of the Rose style murder mystery that looks like it's kind of. I remember before the conference, a rumor went around that they were doing a kind of Disco Elysium type game, and it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like a kind of Umberto Eco like, wherever the art style is based on medieval manuscript drawings in the marginalia and stuff like that. I've got that book, Remarkable. I can't remember what it's called. Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, which I really recommend. It's a brilliant like coffee table book of like medieval manuscripts and how extraordinary they are. And this game looks like it's picked straight from them. It looks completely mad. I've got no idea what it is, but it's the game in the whole of the not E3 span of time that looked like nothing else I've ever seen before, and it looks very exciting, that one.
Yeah, I'm definitely down with that.
So
Very cool.
Yes. The Steam Next Fest, where they released like literally hundreds and hundreds of demos, and then they fight to the death in a big pit over who's going to play them. I played a good few of these, and I thought we could bounce through a few of them. So one of the ones I enjoyed the most was a game called Old Skies, which is the incoming adventure game by Wadjet Eye Games, who make kind of old school style in terms of the mechanics. They're very beautiful looking games, point and click adventures. I love their game Unavowed, which came out a few years ago.
Oh yeah,
which was a really good take on the kind of wizard detective genre, which is always a bit of a kind of holy grail, I think, for fiction, and they did a really good job of it. And this game, Old Skies, is the demo is really good. It's episodic in the same way that Unavowed was, in that you kind of have cases. And so the basic premise of Old Skies is that you are a agent for a kind of time traveling agency in a world where time travel is both allowed, and for those who have the pockets deep enough for it, actually changeable. You can apply to kind of go into the past and change things, as long as it doesn't sort of cause too many like time paradoxes. There's a moment in the game where you're talking to your handler about a curry house that you really enjoyed eating at, and you say, "Oh, is that place still open?" And your handler tells you that it doesn't exist anymore because the activities that you've done in the past have rendered it out of existence. um, and it's a game, you're sort of the slice that they gave you for the demo is you're going into the kind of, it's actually sort of now, you're from the future, but the demo takes place, I think, in 2024, and you're taking a guy, a rich businessman, out for a meal at his favourite diner. And he gets up from the table halfway through and wanders off and goes off to cause mischief. It's beautiful, really well designed kind of and sounding game. Very simple point and click mechanics. The puzzles in his games are often quite sparsely populated, by which I mean it's not like a kind of old school adventure game where you're having to take one item and combine it with another one. They're not fiddly like that. They often involve making, only a few decisions or a few actions, which often have big consequences, and there's often these big moral moments and big moral quandaries. But yeah, I just can't wait to play this game. The demo is a perfect little slice of you can play it in maybe 45 minutes or something like that. It's its own little short story. It introduces you to the world, and it's just very, very good. It also has a commentary and blooper reel that you can play through the game, which I really enjoyed. It's really good. And the developer, kind of sort of taking you through his process.
That's interesting. I've just recently been playing with Inky, which is the tool used to make, amongst other things, Inkle's games, which are obviously branching narrative games. I think I might just play that in order to get the commentary track. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's really fun. He's a really kind of fun guy, I think. Another one I really enjoyed was Agent 64, Spies Never Die.
Oh yes.
Did you get a chance to play this one?
I opened it. I simply don't have the same nostalgia for GoldenEye that a lot of people do. I had a PC at the time, and so my experiences of GoldenEye were just going around a mate's house and then being handed this diabolically shaped piece of plastic with several levers on it, as though that was any way to play a first-person shooter, and then being just mercilessly drubbed in multiplayer. So I never got into it, surprisingly enough.
Yes, I mean,
so sell it to me.
Well, that was. I will say that was exactly to the decimal point my experience with GoldenEye and N64s. But I did manage to really enjoy Agent 64 Spies Never Die, which is basically a GoldenEye kind of essentially remake. It takes the aesthetics and the gameplay of the classic N64 game and sort of updates it. And makes it nice and easy to control. As I understand it, Kane, Discord stalwart Kane, was talking about how it's really hard to play GoldenEye in emulation, and that there's people trying to mod it so that you can play it with mouse and keys, and it still never quite worked, obviously, because the N64 controller was such a Byzantine, weird piece of kit. So this game kind of makes it smooth and easy to play. I really enjoyed this. I played it a whole bunch of times. You can play it on 3 difficulty modes, and it gives you 1 mission to play with different degradations of difficulty. And it is a GoldenEye-like, so that you have an amount of auto-aim, but you have to still kind of curate your auto-aim by pointing yourself in the right direction, and you have a button you can press to kind of fine tune your aiming, which is also a holdover from GoldenEye. And there's a bit where you can shoot a guy's head in the toilet, which I understand was a classic moment in the GoldenEye game on the N64. I really enjoyed trying to speedrun it and kind of sort of get my way through it as fast as I can, and I found it very satisfying to sort of the enemies do that thing that they did in the game where they kind of dance around depending on where you shot them, which I always thought was the most extraordinary thing when I first saw it, and it actually turns into quite an interesting mechanic. I don't know if it was back then, but it certainly is here, where you can kind of make enemies dance in order to sort of stun lock them in a funny kind of way. You can prevent them from taking actions, and so at the higher levels where there's no, the higher difficulty levels where there's no health pickups and the enemy, they can kill you in a couple of shots, it becomes this weird kind of kinetic dance where you're moving as fast as possible and sort of, there was a couple of moments in it where I felt almost kind of John Wicky, even in this kind of weird retro world, where I was kind of spinning around, having learned the enemy placement somewhat and knowing I could, stop this one guy from shooting at me, just for long enough so I could shoot the guy who's standing on the other side of me. And yeah, I found it really enjoyable. Like you, I have no particular nostalgia for GoldenEye itself. But I really enjoyed the this kind of take on it. Yeah,
Interesting. There were quite a few retro shooters on the list of games you played, but let's talk about this a bit, because I read an article recently by a guy called Kyle Kushtel, who I don't know what his provenance is. I'll link the article in the show notes. I don't really agree with the overall pessimism or diagnosis of the industry that he presents, which is that it's being increasingly mired in sort of game design conservatism. But I did think he was accurate in picking up a bunch of trends which he says contribute to this, among which are just the increasing cost of game development overall, which is obviously going to make game design more conservative. Familiarity as an increasingly desirable promise of games. Like, familiarity itself is a virtue. And then he also says the collapsing gap between items that generate culture and items that can be nostalgically reflected upon. And he points to remakes being particularly telling about this. He mentions The Last of Us remake is being remade before that cycle of console hardware is even particularly deprecated. And so I was like, my question to you, Jamie Britton, is familiarity a virtue in this overstimulated time-poor age? And are we cannibalizing our past at the expense of the future?
I think it can work very well in the short term. I think it has problems when you kind of look back at it. I often think about the music of the 90s and the indie music that we heard in the 90s and the Britpop kind of stuff, and how that was all in this kind of weird thrall to weird ideas of authenticity and weird cultural sort of whales, like the Beatles or the Sex Pistols or the kind of spirit of punk, which ended up kind of creating a whole bunch of really terrible music that was very meaningful for people in that time and place. I mean, not uniformly terrible music, but like, if you ever tried to listen to the early Blur albums or, anything past the first two Oasis albums, or, I remember at the time that the band Suede were treated as being kind of ludicrously pretentious in kind of how they avoided cliche, and that was kind of seen as just the most distastefully pretentious and uppity kind of form of culture possible. Whereas the real bands, the Oasises and the Blurs, were embracing the fundamental wonderfulness of making the same music that people had been kind of bashing out with guitars for 20 odd years, like kind of pub rock idiots. And I think it is a kind of quick fix that you can get. Like, I'm certainly playing a bunch of these retro type shooters, and I really like the game Dusk. They do give you an immediacy and a familiarity, which gives a sense of pleasure, which is really easy to obtain. It's a kind of sweet treat. And it doesn't mean that these games, or the music of Oasis for that matter, has no intrinsic artistic value. I do think it means that there is more of a time limit on how long that sense of quality will persist. Because I think once you move out of that kind of feedback loop, it kind of diminishing returns. I mean, one of the other games I played, one of the other demos I played was a game called Metal Hellsinger, which is a Doom 16 style FPS shooter, which has a rhythm action element. And the gameplay is really good fun and the music's really great. But the visual aesthetic has that kind of Doom style Meatloaf album cover, demons and gruey kind of gore, which I realized I'm just done with. Like that kind of OTT Doom style. I'm just like playing that game. It's like, well, I'm not going to play this actually because this is just so like overdone now that it's not fun anymore. And it was fun in Doom 2016 to see these kind of, and in Doom Eternal to see these kind of relics updated and given a modern shine. But I do think that those things tend to lose their luster after a while. And the things that are timeless are the things that kind of try and do things differently. Dark Souls remains a completely iconic game full of completely iconic moments and locations because they spent a huge amount of time and effort trying not to repeat things that they'd seen before, or to twist things that they'd seen before beyond recognition. And I think the retro futuristic FPS genre is, as you say, very much about making something that's easily digestible, and less about kind of pushing. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because I mean, the epochal games that they are all remaking / harking back to were, what made those original games successful was their originality, and all the rest of the aesthetic that they presented was really sort of ancillary to how novel they were. So harking back to them sort of misses the point, but I also find them a lot of the time very satisfying to play. So I don't really have an angry horse in this race. My horse is completely neutral.
You got a neutral horse, an ambivalent horse. I mean, there is something to be said that video games in particular, the fact that like an FPS engine is something that, someone with relatively low technical skill can pick up and make something from. I mean, again, another one of the games I played is a game called Slayer's X Terminal Aftermath Vengeance of the Slayer, which is a superb title and is a retro FPS set in the Hypnospace Outlaw universe, where the fiction of the game is it's a game created by one of the edgelord kids on the Hypnospace, sort of fake Angel Fire internet of that game, which is a fictional world that I adore. Hypnospace Outlaw is so funny and well observed. And as someone who had an Angel Fire page at a certain point in the mid to late 90s, I feel like I'm the sort of perfect audience for it. And did you get a chance to play Slayer's X?
No, I skipped that one, I have to say.
It's so funny. And it's funny because the conversation we're having, it is a game, an FPS shooter ostensibly made by this edgelord kid, which contains, lots of a kind of banging new metal soundtrack, like pictures of his like bullying victims in the game, dialogue where he goes like, you go out of your bedroom and into these sewers, and he says something like, the Slayers have poisoned the sewage well, and now the poops are coming to life. Gross. Like he says something like that. And you're basically running around. It's a Duke Nukem 3D style game where you are a kind of teenage kid, edgelord, demon slayer running around shooting poops and pictures of your classmates and stuff like that. And it's very clever because a lot of the enjoyment of it is imagining the human being who has made this game. And the world that he exists in, and it perfectly explicates his sort of worldview. And yeah, it's really funny, and I think it is an attempt to kind of wrestle with some of the stuff we've been talking about in a kind of comedic way. And I had a lot of fun with it. It's deeply silly, but sort of it's got such a great sense of humor. And that kind of world, like the very online world of teenage boys in late 90s internet culture, is just rife for hilarity, because everyone was so, I remember it was so ridiculous back then to be online. And it really captures that kind of weird mix of sort of, I don't know, narcissism and teenage idiocy.
Maybe I will
really
pick it
enjoy.
up then. Yeah, because even if it isn't a good shooter in itself, I like the idea of using that as a sort of biographical device.
It will definitely make you laugh. I'll say that. Another one I played was Angerfoot.
Oh, I gave this a go. This is good fun.
Yeah, you talk about Angerfoot.
Oh, really? I don't actually have a lot to say about it. I mean, it has it shares a bit of DNA with these games, because a lot of these sort of retro shooters feel like they're designed for speedrunning, and this is obviously a sort of time attack ish game where you're going through these quite small levels and punting enemies with animal faces with your foot, and alternately shooting them. It's very propulsive in the manner of Hotline Miami, even though it is first person. I just love how designed everything is in it. Like, it is, despite coming on the back end of this retro conversation, it's not at all retro. It feels very modern in its visuals. Even like every icon in the menus has been given love and character. Like your mouse pointer in the menus is a little footprint, which is cute. Everything just feels very kind of cohesive and focused. I didn't play it for very long, but I did enjoy it. It's the sense of it, the music, everything.
Yes, I sometimes think with Devolver games in particular that they often make perfect demos.
Yeah.
Like I played this and I thought I did exactly the same thing that I did with their game, like Ape Out, was that game called? Whereas like I played the demo and I thought, this is such a good communication of what this game is and what it involves. I don't think I need to play the actual game of it now. Because it just felt like, that's just given me everything I'm going to need. And I really enjoyed it and I thought it was really admirable, but I thought it was probably, about the amount of time I want to spend with it,
Right. Yeah.
fully expressed. But yeah, I agree. It's got a lovely vibe to it, really unique, and I appreciate that, certainly. Another game I played was The Silent Swan. Did you get a look at The Silent Swan?
I gave it a very brief go, but I was defeated by it, I have to say, Jamie.
Yeah, it's a game that doesn't want you to play it. And not for clever spec up the lines reasons, but for bad design reasons.
Yeah. It was a good demo in that sense, because it did demonstrate all the ways in which you probably shouldn't play the full game.
No,
which is mean. It may yet improve, and it's very nice to hear a Welsh voice in games. I do like that.
Yes,
but
yes.
So just to before we get into what it actually is, my problems with it were just completely practical. Like, it didn't provide a settings menu that was instantly accessible, and you can't really withhold a settings menu if you have a very long introductory set of cutscenes. Because your player is going to experience the very opening of your game in the worst possible way. And then when I had to quit to the main menu in order to access the settings menu, it just lost all my progress. So, and there wasn't even a way to change mouse sensitivity anyway. So I uninstalled it. But I assume you persisted longer than I did and saw more of its charms.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about charms, but I certainly persisted. It's just because it interested me. I love a walking simulator. I love a Dear Esther, and the voice actor in this game is doing a Dear Esther voice. He sounds a bit like I know you said he's Welsh, and he is, but he sounded quite a bit like Alex Wiltshire to me. It was kind of slightly grimdark steampunk Alex Wiltshire. Someone else can play it and decide if I'm right. But yeah, just interesting. It's an open world walking simulator, which is a novel idea. The demo starts you out, and you'll I mean, I'll just skip through the kind of plot because it's sort of uninteresting, really. Your wife has gone missing. You're going to go and find her.
Your wife, who is voiced by Bells.
She is voiced by Bells. I like that. Yeah. You wake up in the middle of the night. Your wife, who talks like Bells, is on the balcony. She says, "Don't worry about anything, darling. Go back to bed." You go back to bed, and then she's gone. And you spend 16 years looking for her. This is all in the first cutscene. And then you come back home, I think you've given up, and you get off the train and you walk in through these big gates towards this city. Your walking speed is very slow. You can run, it's still slow. And then you can also get on bikes. But I got on a bike and rode it along this big steampunk highway. And then when I got off the bike, I couldn't get back on again. So I had to walk the rest of the way forwards. That said, I really liked it, despite all that stuff, because it kind of, it's obviously an indie game made by a small group of people. The design of the city and the design of the world was kind of, I don't know, spectacular, I think. And I like the idea of people making big, crazy games based on the weird spaces that they see in their imaginations. And I don't think there's been enough of that. I think often, particularly with like a walking simulator, Dear Esther, case in point, or Gone Home, they deal with these discrete locations that they can, kind of design and curate for the players very carefully to great effect in both those games. This game does the opposite, and it fails so far, because it doesn't really make sense to have a walking simulator set in an open world. But as I say, I like the idea that games could start doing this sort of thing a bit more, where, as I say, people can come up with impossible architecture and put it into a world, and you can kind of wander around it a bit. And I like that about it. I didn't really like anything else about it, but I like what it represented, and I hope that there's a game they could make out of this, I'm sure. I just hope, that indie games play in this space a bit more, because, there's a couple of moments in that demo where you're looking up at the sky and you're seeing these impossibly enormous towers, on the horizon, and it's just really kind of spectacular, and it feels like the inside of someone's dreams, and, I love that.
Cool. I won't reinstall it.
No, don't.
Sorry.
I don't think I will either. I mean, also it's called The Silent Swan, and there's already a walking simulator called The Unfinished Swan. So they need to rethink the title because it's too close to it.
Was that the end of Next Fest?
That was the end of Next Fest, yeah.
Could I tell you about the game I've been playing?
Please do.
Which I don't think is in Next Fest, but it is probably the vision of one person, and in a similar way to The Silent Swan. Somewhat cumbersome, perhaps, would be the way to describe it in its design, but certainly an idiosyncratic vision, possibly an obsession. I've been playing a game called Shadows of Forbidden Gods, which is not quite a 4X strategy game. It's probably got at least 3Xs in it. Not triple X, though, importantly. You don't really explore because the world is visible to you as a map from beforehand, but you do expand, you do definitely exploit, and ultimately you really, really exterminate, because you are a horrible god from some cursed past waiting to be reborn into this sort of large fantasy world that you will then conquer or consume, depending on what your sort of Lovecraftian shtick is. And you do this via sort of Crusaders Kings style overworld map. You send out agents. It's turn-based. You send out agents to infiltrate human settlements and spread the influence of your cult. And there's lots of ways to do this. You can sort of simply just cause chaos by raiding, for example, and you bring about generalized unrest, which might disrupt food production in a farming community that feeds a larger city. You can assassinate leaders and then have them replaced by their weaker offspring. You can bribe guards. You can shift blame for your crimes onto innocent human heroes who are actually trying to hunt your agents down. You can infiltrate city sewers, and the poops don't come alive, but you can start plagues. Just lots of nice, charming things that you can do. And eventually you'll sort of be able to make a city just so depressed that it's susceptible to your influence that you can then completely enshroud it in shadow. And then once you've done that to a number of places and region, you sort of take control of it as a larger power block via a particular agent who has certain skills in that regard called the Monarch. And each agent comes with its own set of differently weighted stats. You can recruit different ones at different times. And they have particular quite colourful abilities that unlock over time, and you can choose which ones you upgrade. Which ones you unlock as you upgrade them. And the range and sort of interplay of these agents is really interesting. Like I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what's possible, like synergy wise. There's a sort of jester style agent who goes around with a pet monkey. It's good at sort of deflection and subtle sabotage. And there's a courtier who's good at like social intrigues and infiltration. And then there are sort of tanky agents as well who will sort of catch a lot of heat for your actions, which can be useful to draw the heat away from your other agents. Because as these agents commit various crimes, they attract different sorts of attention, sort of like either a sort of neutral fame, which can be an asset or a hazard, depending on how things go for you, or other people view them as a threat. But that not necessarily directly linked to an understanding of them as cultists, but like eventually that becomes apparent, and human heroes will then confront them and fight them in a battle system that I completely don't understand, perhaps isn't even entirely implemented. But there's a sort of ordering to your actions which feels sort of strategic, but also just sort of necessary. Like, I mean, it feels like you don't. Although there's lots of choices before you, it's pretty obvious that what you have to do is weaken outlier communities to bring down the security levels of larger cities, so that your intrigues there don't take a prohibitive amount of time. Because every 10 rounds or so that an agent spends engaged in an activity, then they're interrupted by these multiple choice events that usually ask you to give up trade treasure or time for success or something like that. And then the humans are working against you too. They all have their own sort of heroes, which are the equivalent of agents. They're all moving around the world independently. And in a short time of starting the game, one of those humans becomes the chosen one, which means that they know fully of your plans to resurrect yourself and bring darkness to the world. And they start at least in the games I've played, on the other side of the continent, and they begin making their own alliances with the other human factions there to build up resistance to your intrigues and the spread of your darkness, basically. And there's an incredible richness to the simulation. I don't really know how much of it actually links in to things you can do. Like there's a lot of detail there down to like the preferences and like peccadillos of rulers in each city, like in Crusader Kings. And I haven't really seen an obvious lever to pull to exploit those individual things. So I don't know if that's just like the developer getting carried away with the amount of detail that he can generate, or whether those are things that kind of really interlink with actual strategies. But it feels very kind of deep and interesting. It's very, very fiddly. In terms of the UI, it's a nightmare, I would say. Like it's obviously like the scrappy passion project of a single developer. It has that kind of feel to it, and the UI doesn't distinguish between your own agents and humans on the map. So it's very hard just to look at a glance and see where anything is, even. But I've found enough of it that is really novel and weird, in a way which was worth persisting past those sort of UI problems for. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. I think I'm going to give this one a go. One of the things that, like, you mentioned like Crusader Kings as a reference, and like I again, like Crusader Kings is one of those games I want to enjoy probably more than I actually do. But like when I do enjoy Crusader Kings, it's because it feels like a simulation of something like really vivid and real feeling. Right, it suddenly feels like, oh wow, this really is like a kind of a simulation of courtly politics and intrigue taking place, on my screen, and that will last for a while, and then suddenly it will kind of fall away, and I'll go, no, it's just like, this is just ridiculous. I'm just like playing like solitaire, like
right,
there's really nothing, it lives and dies on that kind of veil of verisimilitude. Is this a game that has any kind of sort of sense of that? Or is it more a kind of strategic kind of thing?
No, I think you're probably exactly right about the extent. I mean, it's the veil has yet to fall fully from my eyes because it's quite the objectives it sets for you as a player are sufficiently different from other games that I'm interested in pursuing them, regardless of how deep that strategy actually is. But I think maybe after a couple of rounds, a couple of games of it, it'll the mechanics of it will become much more apparent, and some of that kind of sense of verisimilitude in the simulation will begin to feel a bit more fake as I see all the kind of options recurring again, or in ways which are just make them feel more generic. So I don't know. I haven't plumbed the depths of it yet, but there are different gods that you can play, and each one of those promises a very very different sort of strategy and end game. So there's at least one god which is a giant world-eating snake, and you then have to protect it after it's born for as it grows, which suggests a very different set of objectives from the gods that I've been playing currently. So
That's
it,
fantastic.
it feels like it feels like there could be a lot of depth to it, or that could be just smoke and mirrors. I don't know yet, but I'm going to play it a bit more, I think, and find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think people who play Crusader Kings long term, what they learn is that, like, you get out of it what you put into it. You can just kind of, after a certain point, you do see the numbers and you do see the matrix, and it becomes very easy to kind of quote unquote win. Which means that people get really into kind of role playing it more and setting themselves, peculiar goals, like, turning all of Africa into a Bohemian empire or whatever.
Yeah.
It's crazy stuff like that. My friend Tom is fond of playing Hearts of Iron 4 and changing history so that Mexico becomes the global power following 1945. And I think these kind of systems heavy strategy games, they can really come into their own if if sort of both parties in terms of player and developer have put the time in, and you can end up kind of coming up with some really weird and wonderful stuff. And I love the the idea of eldritch gods being the kind of players in this world. Just sounds sort of a really interesting spice. I like the
Yeah.
idea of the chosen one being that that's the, in any other video game, that would be the character you play as. I like the idea that that he's a guy on the other side of the map. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about it for this podcast. If you'd like to tweet us, you can do so at Crate and Crowbar. You can watch these recordings as videos on YouTube, where you can find other stuff by us. The address for that is youtube.com/Crate and Crowbar. Thanks as always to our backers on Patreon. You can back us too at patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar, or you can simply join our lovely Discord community, the link for which is on our website, crateandcrowbar.com. That's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Jamie Britton. Thank you,
Thanks for listening,
listener.
everybody.